obviously there's been this whole development with the mainstream media once again trying to recreate what happened in Syria, trying to recreate the propaganda, the false flag attacks. And I'm not afraid to call it false flags because that's exactly what this is. So I'm going to go ahead and debunk the entire narrative surrounding that the Bucha attacks were done by the Russians, because it makes no logical sense, even if you don't know anything about the situation. Russians were living in harmony with the people there in this region, which is near Kiev. And there was no animosity. In fact, the mayor was celebrating that, the Russians left, and the Russians left because they didn't have any military need to stay there. So they left. So there was nothing going on during this whole time. Nothing was said about any sort of animosity, any sort of tension. They were living in harmony by all accounts. And then, of course, we see a few days ago this whole narrative of, wow, there are bodies all over and the Russians did this. And I'm going to go over how that happened. So there was this accusation that there were Russian bodies, and there were videos, obviously, of Ukrainian bodies, and that the Russians did it. Now, there were videos all over just showing the bodies and how they were extremely graphic, and they were plastered all over Telegram channels and social media. And then the mainstream media took this and said automatically, without any evidence, oh, this is Russia. And then they released a set of obviously calculated headlines that all essentially said the same thing, comparing Putin once again to ISIS, saying that he's worse than ISIS, talking about how this was his massacre and all of this, right? And so it's funny because we were all watching this and we're like, oh my God, here we go again. Because when you're with a bunch of journalists at a wedding, you really don't ever stop talking about what's happening. It's really hard. And so we're looking at this and we're like, this does not add up. So I have a thread. I have two threads. The first one I put in, the second one I kind of just go over on our own on the show, but you guys can find it on my Twitter. I just put it up today. So this is according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, right? The Bucha attack isn't real. So the Russian Ministry of Defense has denied that the attack is from their doing. Obviously, it's a real attack, but they're saying that it's not real in terms of the Russians doing it. And they said it resembles a planned media campaign. Multiple witnesses claim they've seen staged and moving bodies. One of these witnesses was Gonzalo Lira, who we had on our show. He said that if you watch the video, you can see the bodies being staged and moved around. You can also look at how they're positioned, how it looks very staged. And also, of course, he has experience doing film work. And it's very obvious when things are staged. Now, a lot of the Russian pushback was based on several facts, among them being that after the Russian troops withdrew from Bucha, like I just said, the Ukrainian army shelled the city, which may have caused civilian casualties. So they're saying that the Ukrainians did it. And there's a video here, and you guys can watch on your own. This is a video that showed the bodies, and you guys can see what it looks like and how suspect it is. So you can just play it out. There's no sound. Yeah. So as you guys can see, as the video just continues, they're driving past it and there's bodies everywhere. Now, one of the things that was really suspect was how there was a time gap between the time the Russians left and the time these bodies suddenly appeared. And I'm going to go over more of that in a little bit. But the next thing that I wanted to go over was the evidence contradicting what the accusations against Russia have been all over mainstream media. In fact, if you just Google the Bucharest attacks or the Bucha attacks, you can find every mainstream media article basically blaming Putin, blaming Russia, saying that Zelensky is demanding that he be tried for war crimes. The U.S. is demanding, Biden is demanding that he be tried for war crimes, which is very rich because we never try any of our war criminals. In fact, we elevate them, rehabilitate them, and they hold key positions of power right now. So the hypocrisy is astounding. But let's look at the timeline. The Russian units completely left Bucha on March 30th, right? And on March 31st, the Bucha city mayor, Fedoruk, confirmed that there were no military in the city and failed to mention that any residents were shot in the streets with their hands tied, because that's the position that these people were found and shot with their hands tied. And this is very key in understanding that there's so much more going on in here than meets the eye. The Ministry of Defense also said that the so-called evidence of crimes in Bucha appeared to be only on the 4th day. So this is once again what happened in between that time. Why? So these people are just lying on the ground, and this is what the New York Times is saying, that these bodies were there forever, and that also doesn't add up, because if the bodies were there for a while before the Russians left, why are their clothes not more deteriorated? Why did nobody say anything prior to that? So none of this is adding up, right? And let's go ahead and look at number 4. There's further evidence of the ready-made statements and allegations with no verifiable documents or logical timeline. So this is more on what the mayor said. The mayor of Bucha on March 31st happily announces the departure of the Russian army. Didn't mention anything about the dozens of victims and corpses on the street. Russia's permanent representative to the UN showed another proof of the theatrical performance in Bucha. And then, of course, this is, I believe, from Moon of Alabama. The former Indian ambassador, M.K. Bhadrakumar, called it an outright fake. So he's outright saying this is entirely fake. An indignant Moscow has angrily demanded a United Nations Security Council meeting on Monday over the allegations of atrocities by Russian troops in areas found around Kiev through the past month. Prima facie, this allegation is fake news, but it can mold misperceptions by the time it gets exposed as disinformation, which is exactly what's happening. And by the way, they denied it. The Russians wanted a meeting over this. They wanted to have an investigation. That investigation has been denied. If the Russians were the ones doing this, why would they deny the investigation? That doesn't make sense either. A TASS report says the Russian Defense Ministry said on Sunday that the Russian armed forces had left Bucha, located in the Kiev region, on March 30th, while the evidence of crimes emerged only 4 days later after Ukrainian security service officers had arrived in the town. The ministry stressed that on the 31st, the town's own mayor, Anatoly Fedoruk, had confirmed in a video address that there were no Russian troops in Bucha. However, he did not say anything about the civilians, and we've seen as much. Even more surprising is that within minutes of the breaking news, Western leaders, heads of state, foreign ministers, former politicians, popped up with statements duly kept ready and only based on the videos, second long videos and a clutch of photos, ready to pour accusations. So like I said, they had the mainstream media ready to hit send on the button, and you could see all of the same type of headlines and accusations that were pushed out onto the forefront of the media. So on April 3rd, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense published a video of the so-called Russian atrocities. And the New York Times posted the footage posted by Ukraine's defense ministry and photographs from news agencies showed the bodies of men in civilian clothes on the streets of Bucha, a town northwest of Kiev. Images showed some corpses with hands bound behind their back. And the New York Times, in this particular instance, also stated that they were unable to verify the assertions made by the Ukraine's defense ministry. So the New York Times posted something without verification. Shouldn't be surprising to all of us who have been around and know what they've done since the war in Iraq and Syria, and I could go on, Russiagate. But there's just more. The more important thing about this was just to reiterate that even in the article, the New York Times admits that they were unable to verify the assertions that were made, but they still put it out there. They still put it out there because their job is to create the narrative that this is Russia's doing. How dare Russia do this? Look at the massacre. Look at the genocide that Putin is doing. Look what these people are doing. Get angry. Get upset. Look at the poor Ukrainians. And the Russian Defense Ministry, of course, decided to clap back and say, this is entirely false. And they denied all the accusations of the Kiev regime. And they stated several things. They said all the facts are here. And they said all the photos and videos published by the Kiev regime allegedly testifying to some, quote, crimes committed by Russian servicemen in Bucha, Kiev region, are just another provocation. So they're saying this is another Western provocation. During the time that the town has been under the control of the Russian armed forces, not a single local resident has suffered from any violent action. Russian servicemen have delivered and distributed 452 tons of humanitarian aid to civilians in the Kiev region. So just to reiterate that, a lot of people aren't talking about it, but I look at that information. The Russian Ministry of Defense constantly puts out the numbers of how many tons of food they're delivering to the people. They constantly refresh and say, this is how much food has been delivered to Kiev. This is how much food has been delivered to Mariupol. This is how much food we're sending out. This is the aid. Nobody talks about that in Western media. They continued, for as long as the town was under the control of the Russian armed forces, and even then, up to now, locals in Bucha were moving freely around the town and using cellular phones. The exits from Bucha were not blocked. That's one of the accusations, that the Russians blocked the exits, but we have seen video evidence that directly contradicts that. All local residents were free to leave the town in northern direction, including to the Republic of Belarus. At the same time, the southern outskirts of the city, including residential areas, were shelled around the clock by Ukrainian troops with large caliber artillery, tanks, and multiple launch rocket systems. There's more of this because this is true, and it's verified by mainstream media that does admit that Ukrainians have been putting civilians in danger. We would like to emphasize that all Russian units withdrew completely from Bucha as early as March 30th, the day after the Russia-Ukraine face-to-face round of talks in Turkey. Moreover, on March 31st, the mayor of Bucha, Anatoly Fedorov, confirmed in a video message that there were no Russian servicemen in town. He didn't mention any locals shot in the streets with their hands tied. If that had happened, why didn't the mayor mention it? It is not surprising, therefore, that all the so-called evidence of crimes in Bucha did not emerge until the fourth day, when the Security Service of Ukraine and representatives of Ukrainian media arrived in town. So again, we've seen this sort of thing happen in other instances. You could go back to Mariupol, the hospital, the schools, the Jewish synagogue, or the Jewish memorial, and all of these were proven as fake as the ghost of Kiev, and I could go on and on. But again, there were obviously media personalities that arrived, and as soon as the media arrived, then is when the public heard about this attack. And lastly, they continue, it is of particular worry that all of the bodies, the people whose images have been published by the Kiev regime are not stiffened after at least 4 days, have no typical cadaver stains, and the wounds contain unconsumed blood. All this confirms conclusively that the photos and video footage from Bucha are another hoax, a staged production and provocation by the Kiev regime for the Western media, as was the case in Mariupol with the maternity hospital, as well as in other cities. This isn't the first time this playbook happens in regard to accusing Russia of something perhaps Ukrainians did, or completely ignores the fact that Ukrainian soldiers have been using civilians as human shields and have been putting them in danger at the very least. So here's the video of the mayor of Rubizin, and this mayor particularly admits that the problem is that so-called Ukrainian defenders destroy civil infrastructure and target civilians. So this is a mayor admitting that these soldiers are putting the Ukrainian people in danger.
Обстановка сложная достаточно. Вся проблема заключается в том, что эти так называемые захисники просто уничтожают объекты городской инфраструктуры, бьют по людям, в основном по гражданским. Постоянно работает артиллерия, в основном хаотическим порядком, просто для уничтожения людей. Занимаются эти твари долго, много погибших. Я благодарен главе республики. У нас позавчера завезли гуманитарную помощь. Мы вчера почти 7 тысяч человек выдали гуманитарную помощь. Будем еще завтра выдавать. Из Луганска помощь подходит. Подходит помощь из города. Сложно, город горит. Постоянно идут артиллерийские обстрелы. Понимаете, они уже потеряли человеческий облик. Это нацизм. Вот тут повыбрасывали людей, 14-градусный мороз, повыбрасывали женщин, детей, грудных детей. Выгнали просто на улицу, позанимали квартиры. Все остальное. Занимались мародеркой. Еще раз говорю, просто расстреливают и убивают людей. Мерзавцы и негодяи. Это нацисты. Чистейшей воды.
Okay, and one of the things I want to point out from this video is that what the mayor is saying has been said by many people. Many videos we've shown on this show, many videos you can find on Telegram, on alternative media, because every sort of dissent or contradicting narrative to the state narrative is censored, or accounts are taken down, or it's just shadow banned by the algorithm. And you can find this stuff. This is what he called Nazism. This is what's been happening in Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk for the last 8 years. This is why the people wanted to be independent of Ukraine. This is why they were asking Putin to intervene. They were asking Russia to intervene. This is why, because this is nothing new to what the people of those regions have been experiencing under these band-right fascists. And that's exactly what the mainstream media on the West has been trying to downplay, while simultaneously, less than a year ago, they were talking about fascists and taking over the White House, which again, every single time, the idea of Trump comes back, they continue to talk about how they want to abolish white supremacy while sending money and weapons to neo-Nazis. I have to constantly say that because I still think people don't understand how ridiculous this is. Now, Wyatt posted this, and I think Patrick Lancaster from PL News who's also been on the ground doing amazing work, talked about this too, that the videos from Bucha that emerged from the Western media said that the city is being cleared from saboteurs and accomplices of Russian forces. And the Western media hasn't talked about this. So right before this happened, right before the video footage was released of the bodies that we just saw, there was an obvious admission via Facebook by the Special Forces Regiment, Safari, in Ukraine, and that they began clearing the operation in Bucha from the saboteurs and supposed accomplices of Russia. And this was the national police, of course. And supposedly they were experts inspecting the places of Russia's war crimes and removing explosives and ammunitions which hadn't been detonated. But this was in Bucha, and they were in the Kiev region, obviously, which they say was liberated by armed forces of Ukraine, but the Russians literally left because they had no reason to be there. And so the national police reported and said, at the moment, the combatants of the Organized Special Forces Regiment of the National Police Safari, which includes the representatives of subdivisions of the Special Task Police, the Rapid Operational Response Unit, the Tactical Operational Response Police, and explosive ordnance disposal experts, is working in the city. So they said this, and this happened right before, right? So they said, as a reminder, the day before, the head of Bucha city, Anatoly Fedoruk, recorded a video message in which he announced that the city had been liberated from Russian invaders on the 31st of March. So as you can see, what Wyatt says is the National Police of Ukraine announced on Facebook that these special forces in Bucha were quote, currently cleaning the territory of assistance of Russian troops just hours after the footage showing bodies in the streets was first posted. So that is something that nobody is talking about, which puts this whole thing on a whole other level, because if they're cleaning bodies after this footage was posted, how are people going to assert or figure out what exactly is happening? How did this happen so quickly? Why was there a gap in the timeline? This whole situation is really weird. And you guys can see the Facebook post here and basically what they said, the same thing that I just read. And they also said today on April 2nd in the liberated city of Bucha of Kiev, special units of the National Police of Ukraine began cleaning the territory from dispersants and assistance of the Russian troops. And, they kind of laid it out for you, but it just shows you how the timeline is extremely suspect as to how everything happened to work out this way. So going along with that, right? There's video of this particular. He's a Nazi, and this Nazi, I think his name. Let me read his name. His name is Sergei Boatsman Koroltik. He's a famous neo-Nazi, and he's a member of the Azov Battalion. So he recorded this video, and at the 6-second mark, there's dialogue happening, and they say, there are guys without the blue armbands. Can I shoot them? And the response is, fuck yeah. Because the blue armbands signify Ukrainian side. Sometimes they have white armbands if they're Russian forces or Russian favoring civilians or people or soldiers. And sometimes they have nothing on at all. So yeah, you can go ahead and play the video.
Можно по ним стрелять?
Ебать, он так спешил, что аж заехал на кента, блядь, понял?
Да, это что?
Тупо.
So it's really interesting to me that they're able to identify who is and who isn't, and the positions of the body is what we're going to get into, are very similar with the Russians found that, that was the story like last week where the Russians were being shot in the leg, and we're going to go over that, but the positions of the bodies are extremely similar. So going back to the media and the propaganda machine, right? So the Western media magically came out with the same headlines on Bucha within minutes and with zero evidence. And this isn't the first time, nor will it be the last, obviously, that they do this. Syria comes to mind. I've mentioned Syria several times because in the same fashion that they were trying to blame the Assad regime and the Assad government on the Syrian chemical attacks, it was discovered it was the white helmets or the moderate rebels that were doing these attacks. And there was numerous false flags in an attempt to blame the Syrian government. And that's why I say it like that. And look at all the headlines. The Guardian, you have the Daily Mail, the Mirror, the Times. These headlines, Putin's genocide worse than ISIS, horror on Bucha, Russia accused of torture and massacre of civilians shot in the streets, Putin will pay for despicable war crimes. I mean, it's crazy because the entirety of the videos of the Russians being shot in the leg and being like killed, and I'm gonna show the video, is ignored. Like they don't talk about any of that, but they do talk about this, and automatically with no evidence, because none of these people are citing any evidence, because there is no evidence to suggest that this is Russia, and the Pentagon has admitted as much. So it's baffling, but at the same time, we have to get used to it because it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. So there's this video from RT, because they're the only ones covering this beside, other Russian media or other Eastern independent media or Chinese media. So this is the UN envoy, and they had the Security Council meeting and rejected and delayed by the West to prolong a smear campaign against Russia over the Bucha incident. So this is what they said. They said that this is a smear campaign, that this isn't true, that Russia had nothing to do with this. So let's go ahead and watch what he says. And he's speaking in English here.
Looking the discussion on Bucha, a clear-cut provocation in classic Goebbels-style risking to have serious implications for international peace and security, the Western delegations rushed to convene a Security Council meeting on the education of girls in Afghanistan some time ago. So you can see where the real priorities are. The reason why the Western delegations do this is very simple. It would not benefit Western cause if the Security Council meeting is convened by Russia, since this would shake anti-Russian narrative they are comfortably promoting. The Western delegations prefer to blend in the situation in Bucha with the discussion of the humanitarian situation at the meeting they convene tomorrow, to shift the focus away from the staged provocation by the Kiev regime.
The West doesn't want an investigation onto this, because if they did an actual investigation into what happened in Bucha, they would absolutely not find Russia guilty, likely. This is why, I mean, if you want, why wouldn't you want an investigation? If you think Russia did it, why wouldn't you want an investigation? Why is Russia the one saying investigate? Why? It doesn't make any sense. And again, this isn't the first time. And so the other part of this whole thing is that Ukrainians have been found to attack their own people, to use civilians as human shields, to stop them from going through the corridors. There are videos of them shooting these Russian soldiers in the leg and assassinating them, executing them as well when they were moving. And then, of course, there is more propaganda where there's the denial that Ukraine has a huge problem with Nazis that didn't begin with this conflict. It's been an issue for a long time. And there was an account on Twitter, Lesia Vasilenko, that posted, "Tortured body of a raped and killed woman. I'm speechless. My mind is paralyzed with anger and fear and hatred. Hashtag stop genocide, hashtag stop Putin." Now, this person on Twitter, just like they've been doing this whole time, posted and said this swastika, right, was placed by Russians in Putin's army. The reality is that this video comes from a different, I think it was a school or of a murder that happened to a Ukrainian, but it was done by the Azov battalion and the members of the Ukrainian army. And you can find the video with Patrick Lancaster, who has been on the ground, and he broke the story. He was like, this is a fake post, because this is in the video that I had covered. So Wyatt said this Ukrainian member of parliament posted a photo of a woman tortured and murdered by the Nazi regiment of the Ukrainian National Guard a week ago, and is passing it off as the Russians' handiwork. This isn't a mistake or an aberration. It's the Ukrainian nationalists' entire MO. And yeah, I forgot to mention that this woman is a member of the Ukrainian parliament. So how does a member of the Ukrainian parliament get away with posting something so entirely false? Either they're irresponsible, or, like as Wyatt said, this is their entire MO. And further, he pretty much says what I just said. Footage of the victim of this horrific Nazi lynching in the basement, there it is, the basement of an Azov military facility, was originally posted by Patrick Lancaster, PL News Today, on March 27th. Like clockwork, every time Ukrainian nationalists commit these unspeakable atrocities, they blame them on Russia. And that's exactly what happens, and that's exactly what they do. So why wouldn't people be suspect of yet another accusation coming from the same perpetrators that led us into wars over the falsification of supposed weapons of mass destruction, supposed chemical attacks, etc. Right? This next part of this whole debunking of the Bucha thing is, to me, one of the most important parts that can really just debunk this whole thing. Because here's what's happening. The latest videos of the Russian-bound soldiers show similarities in body positions to the ones that have been found in Ukraine. Well, of supposed Ukrainians, right? And there was a video that showed this on Telegram. And it's a video that's extremely graphic that if you watch it, we're going to play it, but be warned, this is extremely graphic and it shows dead bodies. The positions of these dead bodies are the ones that are so similar to the ones that were found in Bucha. So yeah, let's just go ahead and play this video. And it's from the Telegram. If you absolutely need to see it, you can find it on the Telegram.
Он живой еще, блядь. Смотри, куда? Смотри, он живой еще, он хрипит уже. Ну все, он хрипит уже, блядь.
Перчатки хорошие.
Он, блядь, он хрипит. Все, блядь.
Не хочу я его оставлять, на.
Все, вот они, блядь, защитнички. Русская армия. Вон одна догорает, блядь. Одна догорает. Слава Украине!
Okay. So I'm going to talk through this real quick, guys. So this is a video of the killing of the Russian prisoners by the Ukrainian military. And all of these people had their throats cut. Okay. And this is, you guys can see that one of the prisoners was dying. He was still shaking. They continued to shoot him. And it was filmed in Kiev, but the location is still unknown. And yeah, so that's what it's about. So these are the Russian prisoners, okay? So we're clear. Their hands were tied, their bodies were laid out in a certain way. And I had to put that out there so we can really go on to the next thing, which is the fact that this is extremely similar to how these bodies were lying in Bucha. So this is from Reuters. This is from mainstream media Reuters. A man lay sprawled by the roadside in the Ukrainian city of Bucha on Sunday, his hands tied behind his back and a bullet wound to his head. One of hundreds of local residents that officials say have been found dead in the wake of the 5 weeks of Russian occupation. Bucha's deputy mayor, Taras Shapravinsky, said 50 of the dead residents found after Russian forces withdrew from the city last week were the victims of extrajudicial killings carried out by Russian troops, and the officials have accused Moscow of war crimes. So that's Reuters saying, oh, this is, they were found with their hands tied behind their back. When the Russians were found, they also had their hands tied often. They were shot in the head. Like I said, they were also, their throats were slashed and they were laid out sprawled across the ground like that. Now, the Washington Post admitted that the Ukrainian army has placed civilians in danger, right? With this title, even though they say Russia has killed civilians in Ukraine, they admit Kiev's defense tactics add to the danger. So they have to say that. But here it is. Increasingly, Ukrainians are confronting an uncomfortable truth. The military's understandable impulse to defend against Russian attacks could be putting civilians in the crosshairs. Virtually every neighborhood in most cities has become militarized, some more than others, making them potential targets for Russian forces trying to take out Ukrainian defenses. So they sort of tell the half-truth here, right? So what's happening is that the Ukrainians are using their own civilians as human shields. They know that the Russians are trying to attack the military equipment, so they keep putting these people in front because they don't care, because that actually benefits them, because then they get to blame this on Russia and say that Russia is killing civilians. That's essentially what's happening. And the article continues, I am very reluctant to suggest that Ukraine is responsible for civilian casualties because Ukraine is fighting to defend its country from an aggressor, said William Shabazz, an international law professor at Middlesex University in London. But to the extent that Ukraine brings this battlefield to the civilian neighborhoods, it increases the danger to civilians. So it's, they're admitting it. And this is the Washington Post. This is the newspaper, the publication that led people into non-existent weapons of mass destruction. The Ukrainian military has a responsibility under international law to remove their forces and equipment from civilian populated areas. And if that's not possible, to move civilians out of those areas. If they don't do that, that is a violation of laws of war, because what they are doing is they are putting civilians at risk because all that military equipment are legitimate targets. Do you think the Ukrainian army does not know that? They know exactly what they're doing, and this is why Russia is accusing them of using their civilians as human shields. And that's precisely what we've seen. Now, the New York Times also talked about the Russians that were shot in the leg. Here's the New York Times article published recently in March. A video shows Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine being beaten and shot in their legs. Initially, this was told that it was Russia propaganda, that this was fake news, but even the New York Times has had to confirm that these videos are, in fact, very legitimate. A video shared online Sunday shows soldiers who are likely Ukrainian, as you can see with the blue band, beating and shooting prisoners from the Russian army military. The footage shows 5 of the prisoners tied up and lying on the ground, some held at gunpoint and some with bags over their heads. So similarly laid out in similar body positions. And this isn't the first time the Ukrainians have done this. There is countless video footage that we went over a couple weeks ago that got taken off of Twitter, but it shows that these Ukrainian civilians were stripped, tied, and beaten by these vigilantes in these videos. The person who posted those videos initially on Twitter got taken off of Twitter. But this is from an Australian publication. Horrifying videos show Ukrainian civilians, including women and children, being tied up, stripped, and beaten in these vigilante attacks. And you guys can go to the website. It's www.news.com, and it's .au, Australia. And there are more of the videos there. If you scroll through it, a series of horrifying videos published on social media show Ukrainian civilians, including women and children, tied up. And again, it's including women and children. So if you guys want to see more of that, because we've already shown it, by all means, go into the link. And Reuters has admitted then, as such, that the Pentagon can't independently confirm the atrocities in Ukraine's Bucha. So they're admitting that they don't really know what's going on, and they're pretending that they don't know what's going on, because this is obviously not Russia. Why would Russia do this? Why would Russia leave and then come back and kill people? And then there wouldn't be any sort of anything for days until suddenly a film crew shows up, and now there's all sorts of pictures and all sorts of images, and the entirety of the Western media repeats the same type of headlines, exaggeratingly accusing Putin of being worse than ISIS. It's really obvious to me that this is just not, this is something that they're trying to manufacture yet again. And we've seen warnings of false flag attacks with the biolabs and the bioweapons that also were denied by the United States until Victoria Nuland basically verified them with Marco Rubio saying, well, they exist, but we don't want the Russians to get their hands on it. This isn't the first time they've lied. Like I said, the Jewish Memorial Center, the hospital in Mariupol, countless schools they've accused Russians of bombing, the ghost of Kiev. It just goes on and on and on that we have seen this whole time. The lies, the grandmother who, what was her name? Granny Valentina, who had the shotgun, and they were like saying she was a grandmother who was actually a member of the battalion and has been a part of that group for a while. It's really like everything has been debunked, but people still say oh, it's Russian propaganda. It's Russian propaganda without actually reading, without even looking at the fact that mainstream media has admitted that many of these things are true, but they also have to say, well, it's okay because Russia is attacking them. So they have to justify it and say it's okay, but they have to admit it. I mean, they can't go that far into, saying it's complete and total fabrications without putting a little bit of sprinkle of truth in there. So if you actually pay attention beyond the headlines of what mainstream media is saying, you can see that this whole thing is a giant gaslight. It's a giant, it's bullshit. And it's obviously real. People are dying, but who is committing the atrocities? That is key. And then you have, of course, Zelensky that came from didn't get to have an Oscar, but went and attended the Grammys via video service, right? Where they put a big screen, a green screen behind him. And he got to do his little speech, and Hollywood got to say that they stand with Ukraine and, cry false crocodile tears and how all of a sudden they all love Ukraine. And, Zelensky and Biden are demanding that Putin be tried for war crimes based on what? What about Putin's son and Hunter Biden's laptop with emails, a plethora of emails of his money ties to the funding of these biolabs in Ukraine? What about that? No, you don't get to focus on that. So the point I want to make here is they're losing this narrative. They're losing this battle. If you watch anything remotely non-Western, you can see that Russia has the upper hand in this conflict. The ruble has gone up. Putin's popularity ratings have gone up, while Biden's is sinking, while the United States is facing inflation, high prices in gas. There's an airline shortage of workers. There's a lot of delays going on. We're not moving like smoothly, like things should be moving at this point. There is a lot going on with the whole, let's shift back to the COVID narrative, which is something more I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and what the World Health Organization wants to do. But what's happening is a clear shift as we're seeing the attempts to get rid of Imran Khan in Pakistan. We're seeing just the West kind of latch on and push back, where Putin's like, no, you're going to pay in rubles. And France is like, no, well, we don't want to pay in rubles, but if we'll be allies, if so. So there might be an attempt by France to play ball with Russia, to not follow the NATO popularity crew, the popular girl crew of NATO that's saying, no, you have to stand up to Putin, because they understand that their economy is in dire straits if they don't do what they're supposed to be doing, if they don't provide gas to their people, that they know this is a suicide to their economy, because they're so dependent on this gas, as is Germany, as is the rest of the EU. And what's happening is the West is losing the narrative. They're losing. Russia is on the upper hand, is winning this war. If you want to call it a war, I would say it's more of a conflict within their region. It's a proxy war we're waging on Russia, and so the West is losing it, and that is why you're seeing all of these attempts to vilify Putin, to still create this whole narrative that Russia, the ruble is sinking, the ruble is turning into rubble, is what Biden said, this whole thing. But the evidence shows otherwise. And every single day, Russia is gaining more control of the areas they need more control of. And it takes 2 seconds of going on Telegram and looking at the news coming directly from the Ministry of Defense, directly from TASS, directly from on-the-ground journalists that are in Ukraine right now. And I look forward to continue covering this in particular, this region in particular, and this conflict in particular, because it is one of the most propaganda-ridden type of conflicts I've ever seen in my life. It's more than the pandemic, what they've done to vilify the entirety of Russian culture and Russian people and everything like along those lines is disgusting. And reminiscent of what they've done before, what they did with Iraqis, what they've done with Afghanistan, what they've done with Syria, and even Palestinians who have taken it upon themselves, which I really love, to take the Ukrainian flag and say, support Palestine, because that's what you have to do to get the vast majority of the liberal contingent to care about brown people and people in the global South. But the global South is rising. And, you know, if you're a journalist that lives outside of the Western world or that has traveled a lot, you can see that the global South is rising. That's where the focus is going to be. The global South and the East, China, Africa, the India, and of course, Russia. And we're seeing these countries that have been sanctioned, destroyed, and defeated by the United States come together and oppose Western hegemony, because now is their chance. Now is your chance to do it. What other time are they going to have? And it's almost like this, in spite of their differences, in spite of their political just iterations, some are more conservative than others. You know, Cuba isn't Iran, and Nicaragua isn't the same as India. But in spite of these differences, these countries are coming together to sort of say enough and push back against the Western domination of sorts and shift into this multipolar world. Now, is that going to be enough? Are there going to be players that push back against that join the attempted globalist agenda? That seems like where we're headed, right? We're going to see who really is fully against this globalist agenda. But that was basically the summary of like this whole debunking thing. And like I said, you can go on my Twitter and see I posted the latest breakdown of that in this thread, and basically the same thing that I just talked about.